Hello, everyone. Welcome to Writing Quest. My name is Brennan Pugh. Today we have Adrian Gibson with us, and we are going to talk about his new book, his writing process, his podcast, SFF Addicts, and I'm really excited to have him on. How you doing? And welcome to the show.
Hi, Brandon. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Show off my cover because just give people a little bit of a sense. Got the paperback and the hardcover here. But yeah, lots of mushrooms. We're going to be talking mushrooms today. If
All
you
right.
couldn't tell
I love
by
it.
the title of the book.
Yeah, that's awesome. Mushroom Blues.
Mushroom Blues.
Yeah. So why don't you give us a little bit of your background, kind of tell us who you are and how you got started on this whole writing journey.
Yeah, man. I mean, my writing journey has been kind of like a lifelong thing, but there have been many detours along the way in order for me to circle back and get here. You know, like I come from Canada. I grew up on the West Coast in British Columbia, and I just spent a lot of my childhood drawing and writing and, you know, making up fan comics and stuff like that. I never wrote fan fiction, but fan comics were my vibe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just like full of binders, like those 3-ring binders, just full of, you know, like just sketched comic books and stuff, and like writing dialogue and all that kind of thing for basically the stuff that I was watching and consuming over the course of my childhood. Be like, I love Captain Underpants. I'm going to draw like a Captain Underpants fan comic, or like Narnia or Lemony Snicket and all these different kinds of things. And yeah, like as I got older, veered more into art, but kind of went back and forth with writing and art related stuff. So it was like, I was really big into art in high school, but then went to university for English literature. And during that time, I was also a music journalist. And then I left Canada and lived in Berlin for 3 years. And while I was in Berlin, I basically got burnt out on music journalism and ended up getting into tattooing. And so I did tattooing for like 6 years. And during that career, I ended up moving to Ecuador, where I live now, with my wife. And basically, like, the pandemic hit and I had to close down my tattoo studio. Nobody really wants a tattoo when there's a pandemic going on. It's not really like, it's not an essential job or an essential expense that you can justify during a time like that.
Right.
And so my son was coming and my wife was pregnant, so my son was on the way, and I had to close down my tattoo studio. And I was like, what am I going to do with my time now? You know, like during lockdowns and all that stuff. And I just started writing again. I started illustrating a ton and world building and basically like laying the foundations for what would become the Fungal Verse. And Mushroom Blues is the first book in this shared universe. And so I just really started to take it more seriously. This is probably five years ago, more or less.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so it sounds like you suffer from the same disease that I have. And my wife calls it creative ADD.
Yeah.
Where just any creative thing, I just kind of like, oh, that'd be fun to try. You know?
Yeah. And then you dive into it and it's like 6 years go by, you know?
Yeah.
So maybe it's not like that ADD if I spend 6 years on it, but like I can still tattoo, and I do if I have the opportunity, but I'm not like earning full-time money off of it or anything like that. But yeah, it's like things just catch your eye. It's like a crow seeing something shiny, but it's like your brain seeing some creative opportunity and just kind of kind of urging you to explore it as much as you can.
Yeah. I started, so I'm a musician originally, is what I kind of grew up doing and was forever. And then writing became after, my wife and I have been married for quite a long time. But after we had our daughter, she's 9 now, but I kind of got out of like, I can't really make a living doing this gigging thing. I don't really have the time for it. What do I do? And so as a creative outlet, I kind of turned to writing. Like, it's something I could do at home while I'm sitting in a chair holding the baby, you know, doing stuff. And so that's kind of where that happened for me. But yeah, I get it. You know, just kind of transitioning those creative fields as they come.
Yeah, I mean it's like pivoting based on the circumstances of life, and the way that you describe writing, it's like, yeah, you got a baby in your lap, but
Kids.
I'm just not gonna sit there and like do nothing,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna do something with that time. And even if it's like hastily writing something that turns out to be like okay, then that's still something, and I can rework that when my brain is in a moment where I can put more thought into the quality of that particular thing. But still, to be able to get those ideas out there is really
Yeah.
beneficial. It's like just being a parent doesn't necessitate restricting your possibilities. It's like all of that
Mm-hmm.
is in your own head, basically. Like those barriers that you put up for yourself
Yeah,
based on what you
absolutely.
think a situation will deny you. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, you don't necessarily have to do that. You can navigate that. And it's not going to be like happy go lucky, super amazing every single time you do something. But at the very least, you're doing something and it makes you happy. And, there's
Yeah.
benefit in committing to that.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. One of the things I have always said and thought was, and this is maybe a whole nother discussion, but parenting is one of those things where, especially as a creative, I feel like you have to navigate it. But when you have to accept that you're a parent, otherwise you'll never be happy being a parent.
Yeah.
Because there's so many, there's so many people out there who be like, "Oh, your life ends when you become a parent." I'm like, I don't think so. It's been one of the best things ever. And I think it's important for your kids to watch you be creative.
Mm-hmm.
So they learn to be
Exactly.
creative. So why would you stop doing that?
Yeah.
And like deny them the ability to see you do something like that?
Right. And then obviously it's a generalization, but I can see a lot of that in prior generations where they, especially when it was more like, oh, housewife was more the norm, and there was kind of like a more sort of expected division of labor in terms of like a family unit and that kind of thing. But it's like, I'm a stay-at-home dad, and obviously living somewhere like South America, there's a bit of like, not necessarily from people in our generation. Like all my friends are totally cool with it, and people who have kids are dividing their time between each other, not necessarily like the man goes to work and the wife is at home and taking care of the kids and cooking and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But I can see it in prior generations where it's like there's like a sense that having a family means sacrificing the things that fulfill you as an individual. And that's probably been one of my biggest struggles as a parent, is kind of navigating the murky waters of parenting, because
Yeah.
there's just so much there's so much unexpected stuff that happens. There's like days that can go from super calm to incredibly chaotic in an instant. And just kind of navigating that and figuring out like, how can I sustain myself creatively, which fuels me as a person and makes me happier as an individual, which in turn makes me a better father because I feel more balanced and more eager to do certain things with my kids and with my family based on the fact that I'm also able to nurture the things that I love on a personal level. And so it's like, I think those things feed into each other. And if you just end up sacrificing like an entire part of your life, then that kind of festers as a sort of resentment, and that can end up being dumped on your kids too. So it's like, why not make time for yourself in order to be happy and figure out how to do it based on your lifestyle and circumstances, such that you are at least pursuing some fulfillment as an individual, such that that trickles into the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of that idea of being a whole person. And like, it's like, exercising is a great example of like, you got to do something. Like you have to take the time, even if other people need you, even if other people, whatever, you got to do a little bit of exercising just to take care of yourself, because it makes you a better person for the people who care, that rely on you. And
Right.
Yeah.
Like I'll just like take some free weights into the backyard, like on the grass, and do exercises there. And my sons are like just literally crawling over me and like, thinking it's a game.
It's just a weighted vest. It's just
right,
added weight,
exactly,
right?
dude, exactly. I'm just gonna like do lunges around the yard with like a kid in my arms, and it's like wearing a weighted vest. It's perfect.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it's like, yeah, those are the kinds of things that it's like, A, it sets an example for them. B, it's part of the betterment of you as a person. And in turn, it's like your fulfillment is going to reflect upon how you interact with your family. And they're going to see you as this person who's doing the things that they love to do. And so when they get older, they're going to be like, yeah, I want to do the things that I love too. I don't want to just like pigeonhole myself based on X, Y, and Z. It's like, dad did this. Let's go,
Yeah, definitely. So, well, I want to come back to like how you manage your writing time with your family time, but let's maybe talk a little bit about your. Should we talk? Do you want to talk about where the book origin came from, or do you want to go into your writing process? Which would be best for you to explain it?
I think the origin kind of feeds into the writing process.
Okay, so let's talk about the origin. So I was reading through the description of things and reading it all. This is probably one of the most original things I've seen in a while. So I think it's a really cool premise. So why don't you talk about that and where that whole idea came from?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the sort of world building and illustration that I'd started for the Fungal Verse. And so the Fungal Verse is this idea that I came up with based on a combination of things. So it's like on one hand, I had a dream where I'm like a super vivid dreamer. And so I had this dream where I was in this like really immersive space, like walking through a forest at dusk, and this just like walking through the trees and then entering into like an open glade, and there's just a gigantic mushroom towering above the trees, and it's bioluminescent, and there's like spores floating through the air. And I woke up and I wrote this down. I was like, that's just the coolest goddamn thing ever. Like super atmospheric, especially for a dream. Usually my dreams are much more nonsensical, but this one was like quite brief but very potent. And so I wrote that down, and I thought, like, how could I take this idea and kind of run with it, but also pull on books that have really inspired me. One of my biggest inspirations is Jeff Vandermeer, but specifically his books Annihilation and Finch. So Annihilation is book one in the Southern Reach trilogy, and that book just changed my life. That was the book that convinced me in my 20s that I wanted to take writing more seriously. It showed me, like, this is what writing can do. This is how powerful it can be.
Yeah.
And Finch was the book that just introduced me to how truly weird fiction can be, in the sense that it's this fantasy world where humans colonized this land and basically forced the native population of gray caps, who are these, like, hive mind fungal beings, underground. And that's sort of the backstory. And then over the course of this trilogy, the Ambergris trilogy, the gray caps have reemerged and are basically taking the city back, taking their land back. And so I thought on that book, and I love mushrooms and have had a lifelong passion for it. And that book really struck a note for me in terms of, like, how mushrooms could be incorporated into a speculative fiction story. And so I was like, I love the idea of mushroom people, but I want to write a story that doesn't feel too like fantasy. It feels a little bit more modern, more sci-fi, kind of like a 90s vibe to it, and give the mushroom people more individuality and more agency, as opposed to being part of this, like, homogenous hive mind kind of thing. And so I just started running with it. Like, I was just drawing a ton. I was world building like crazy, which is like a trap that a lot of writers can fall into. I'm sure you know, where it's like,
oh yeah,
you spend so much time yeah, you spend so much time world building, but I think having it in conjunction with art was a way for me to really like visually imprint this world on my brain. So I spent a lot of time creating the fungal people as a race, their culture, their history, pulling a lot of inspiration from Japan, figuring out ways in which their world and their cities would be constructed, you know, architecture, engineering, all these different facets. And I realized at a certain point, like, I'm not really writing that much. So
Yeah.
it's like I'd created a story. It was, you know, kind of like a travelogue, nameless POV character, kind of like the avatar for you to experience this world and see ways in which fungi could better our world, sort of as like a reflection of how we as humans are treating the earth and these fungal people and how they live, as a compare and contrast sort of scenario. But it was boring, man. It sucked. But I just realized like this isn't working as like a narrative, but the world is amazing. And I twisted that and basically like got rid of the story elements and thought more about the world and started pulling in more influences from established genres that I really love. So like Finch is really cool because it's fantasy, there's fungal people, there are humans, there's this interaction going on, but it's also noir. It's also like a murder mystery. So that to me was like, okay, I can use this world as a foundation, but I can also kind of establish that foundation in more established genres, you know, like police procedurals, murder mysteries, noir, cyberpunk, these genres that I really love. And so I just started pulling influences in and ended up writing one book set in the fungal verse, finished the first draft of it, just like burnt out, hated it, you know, not necessarily like it's terrible, but I just like, you know, when you finish something and you're like, you have this like self-loathing kind of feeling where you're just like, God, you know, like what did I create? And it's more just like an ego thing at the end of the day. But I just needed to take some space away from it. I didn't want to leave the fungal verse, but I wanted to kind of veer off in a different direction. And Mushroom Blues started as just a prequel novella idea that I had for that novel. I'd outlined it, and during the writing of that novel, but then after I got kind of burnt out, went back and looked at that outline and thought like, what can I do with this? And it was like a 14 chapter outline, but there were way too many scenes in each chapter. So I'm like, okay, this is like at least like a 30 to 40 chapter novel based on like all the stuff I'd done here. Reworked the outline and then just started writing, you know, like really fell in love with the sort of police procedural kind of basis of it. It wasn't called Mushroom Blues at that point. Henrietta, the main character, was actually a man, and she was in third person. And then through the writing of the initial chapters, I realized like I'm not vibing with this character, but I'm vibing with everything else that's going on. So I changed it to like a middle-aged woman, and then it worked more. And then I was like, okay, let me change up the tense. So I went to, because it was third person present tense, and I changed it to past tense, and it was like, okay, it's working a little bit more. And then I changed it to first person as opposed to third person, and everything just started to click after that. It all felt more intimate. Henrietta just really like flourished as a character, and everyone else that she meets along the way, just experiencing it through her eyes felt so much more natural given the story that I wanted to tell. And this was February of last year. And then I just ran with it. I contacted my friend Felix Ortiz, who's an amazing artist, and was like, can you do a cover for me? And basically just set this deadline for spring 2024 to release this book, and I made it. Yeah, I finished it in a little over a year. But there's so much that I messed up along the way, but it's like those are all the kinds of mistakes that you need to learn in order to become a better writer, become a better marketer, especially with self-publishing, become a better entrepreneur. So there are so many different things that I learned from this that I'm just like, I will cherish that experience just based on the fact that like I recognize the lessons that I needed to pull from it that I can apply to everything else that I do in the future. And yeah, like it's kind of one of those things where you're like, yeah, it was a mess, but I'm happy that it was because it got me here. And I'm just really excited about like what Mushroom Blues ended up being, the ways in which readers are reacting to it, reviewers all across the board. I've been able to do like a ton of fun interviews like this one and meet new people just based on this fact. So yeah, it's been a wild ride, but I'm happy with it in hindsight.
Nice. Yeah. It's so interesting. I talked to someone else about this recently about, we always have this like, it's got to be this exact path. Like we'll start here and we'll do this and we'll do this. And like we create that in our minds and it never is that. And then you just kind of, it's like bumper cars. You just hit the sides a bunch as you go. And then eventually you get there. I think it's great. I think it's cool. I have the same type of world building issue you have where I kind of like I can get real trapped in that real easy and then I'm not doing anything. My issue is always asking why. So like I keep like it's hard for me to write something if I don't know like
that's a never ending kind of like hole that you just continue to dig.
Yep. You can just keep asking why, like, why did this happen? Exactly. Why did this happen? So that's something definitely I struggle with for sure. And I love that, I think what I like so much about Mushroom Blues, I haven't read it, of course, but just reading through this right here, I like that it's grounded in that kind of detective, like that's the part that is like, I understand that from without reading it.
Yep.
And so then the rest of it can be really wacky and different and out there or whatever. But because it's got that element, it's like, it works. You know what I mean?
Yeah, this is exactly something that I realized, not while I was writing it, but when I spoke to Stephen Orion. He's an author, but he also does video interviews on his YouTube channel. So I was talking to him about it, and he just kind of brought up genre and sort of this relationship that the familiar and the unfamiliar can kind of play in a story. And he has his own stories where, it's like a fantasy, but it's a police procedural. And so it just got me thinking about like as I mentioned earlier, the foundation of this world or this particular story is rooted in police procedural and murder mystery, noir, these things that people are very familiar with and can really easily latch on to as like a selling point. Even like a lot of people really love detective stories. They really love murder mysteries, what have you. And so by kind of laying that foundation, I was able to kind of ground the reader as much as I was able to ground the protagonist. I was also able to ground the reader in the familiarity of the certain beats that these genres have. Like you open the book, first chapter, there's a crime scene, there's a murder. How is the protagonist going to solve this? Then along the way, it's like you have very familiar beats in terms of, meeting with the superior officer at the precinct, or interrogations, like a car chase, investigations and searching for clues, and then kind of like questioning people, interviewing perps and all that kind of stuff. those things are there, and they're spaced in such a way where it's consistently kind of pulling you back into, or like pulling you down into the familiar earth of this genre that you know and love.
Yeah.
But along the way, I'm able to introduce really weird stuff, like all of the fungal world building, the fungal people and their biology and their society, their ways of communicating, body horror and like really gross stuff about mushrooms, really beautiful things about mushrooms as well, psychedelics, and sort of like more surreal aspects, but also the peculiarities of individual characters and the things that they're able to bring to the table. And so that balance was something that I did unconsciously, but I think it really works. Like I got an email from my aunt recently, and you know, she's a writer as well. And she's working on self-publishing her first book. Based on what she's seen of my experience, she saw that it was viable to do it this way. And she doesn't read science fiction or fantasy, but she read my book and said that those were the elements. The detective, she loves detective stories. That aspect of the story kept her kind of comfortable enough to keep going.
Yeah.
Even though so many of the other aspects of it were like making her feel sort of like queasy and uncomfortable, still engaged, but you're kind of grappling with the uncanny in a lot of ways. But if you have something familiar like a detective framework, that can keep you going.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot about how much, you know, people really do get stuck. I mean, I'm like this. I get you really stuck in like, this is how a genre should be, or how something should be, or an idea. You know, my book is, what I'm working on is based kind of in a more like a Tolkien type of world with elves and dwarves and all that. And I love that stuff. And like, that's definitely where I want to keep it. But like, you know, now I'm thinking, have I added enough maybe other genres to this? Like, is there a different angle I could come at it from? Because like you said, you know, I think because you've added this detective element in, people who just like detective books but don't like fantasy may still pick it up and it still enjoy it just as much.
Exactly. It's like the reader is not going to, if it's done effectively, the reader is not going to be bombarded with the fact that you're blending genres. But you as a writer can consciously choose genres, and even like I would even say like this blending can go as deep as the world itself and the setting, and approaching something as familiar as like a Tolkien-esque world, where you have orcs and elves and goblins and all that kind of stuff. But the framework of the story, even though like the world elements and races and things like that might be familiar, you can bring in like another genre and blend that in there in order to give a fresh framework for something that is familiar to people. And so you can do a lot of cool stuff there. And I just love genre blending. Like I think some of my favorite stuff is genre blending. And most people, when they hear the term genre blending, they've, you know, like especially from a consumer standpoint, they've probably never even thought about it. It's just this seamless thing that the craftspeople have been able to implement in their work, such that the blending of genres becomes an invisible driver for the entirety of the story.
Yeah. It's making me think about, have you watched Brandon Sanderson's lectures on YouTube? I'm assuming you probably have. It's been a minute since I watched him, but I remember him, doesn't he talk somewhere in there about like using archetypes and how like certain archetypes have like the hero has certain beats that like, this is what the hero goes through.
Yep.
And then what he does is kind of just like picks a bunch of different archetypes, and then he kind of blends the beats. Like he just mixes it all up, and it's kind of making me think of that whole process. But
yeah, I mean, it doesn't even necessarily have to be just genre. Like, yeah, you can take something like the hero's journey and have that be your narrative framework, but along the way, it's like you can mix that with like a unique world or different genres that are still working within the sort of like lattice of the hero's journey. But along the way, what you can do is you can still have those beats, but you can flip them on its head. You know, you can subvert certain things, or you can approach it from a different angle that ends up satisfying the reader based on the beat that they expect unconsciously, sort of like based on all the stuff that they've consumed. And at the same time, give them like a big surprise. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like the interrogation in Mushroom Blues was one of like the coolest and most challenging parts of the book for me to write, because interrogations are so rote in a lot of ways. Like they're tried and true, but you don't necessarily see too many reinventions of the interrogation scene. You know, you have the common like good cop, bad cop. You know, the one of the cops getting fed up with the perp and you know, getting really aggressive and like grabbing them by the collar, that kind of stuff. So for me, it's like I was able to use my world and the sort of like the fungal biology that I'd created in order to give people that familiarity of the interrogation, but completely flip it on its head and make it a really shocking and uncomfortable moment. Yeah. And so there are ways that you can work that into genre beats and tropes. There are ways that you can work that into archetypes, character archetypes, and sort of expectations of what a certain character is going to do in order to fulfill a certain goal. And at the same time, you can work that into narrative frameworks like the hero's journey, etc. Yeah.
This has been an interesting question I've started to explore with people. I'd be interested in your take. How do you define the difference? Like, what would be the difference to you between a stereotype and an archetype? Now you have to think about it for about 30 minutes.
Yeah. That's a difficult one, man. I think it's just like a linguistic application more than anything. They're both very similar things. I think trope as well is a word that has different connotations for different people. Right. You know, so it's like a stereotype, an archetype, a trope. These are things that have been repeated and established. It just depends on the individual person to determine for themselves whether their feelings about a trope or an archetype or a stereotype. So I think it's more just like it's basically just like a linguistic jumble. And you know, I think stereotype more often gets used in a broader context. Archetype generally gets used more in a character context. Trope is the kind of thing that often has a very heavy-handed negative connotation to it. So, but for me, it's like an interrogation is a police procedural trope. You know, the superior officer,
and you kind of have to have it, because if like there's no way to get around it, really.
Right. But the thing is, like, some people love tropes. You know, you look at like romance readers, they want those tropes. They want the relationship to develop in certain ways based on the satisfaction that they get from the expectations that they've laid out. And so a trope can be negative or positive depending on the person, depending on the genre. So many different things. For me, like, an interrogation is a positive trope within police procedurals. You know, the interactions with like a superior officer is a positive trope within this genre. And for me, the fun thing is to be like playing into the aspects of the trope that I like, and at the same time being able to twist them in ways that are unexpected,
Mm-hmm.
or really work them in service of the story, as opposed to feeling like a cookie cutter replication of something that's come before.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with stereotypes. It just depends on how people apply the word and the context. And with archetypes as well. It's like, I think sort of generally those words are kind of interchangeable. It's just the common application of how people use them and what they apply them to. So it's like, yeah, like a lot of people associate archetypes with characters, with, if you're thinking about psychology, with personality traits, these kinds of things. I think archetype, especially if you're getting into like Jungian psychology, there's a lot of use of the word archetype.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually applies to character traits, personality traits, and how those apply in the way a character achieves their goal over the course of a story, or an individual person in real life is adopting certain traits in order to, live their life. And a lot of it is just in an unconscious way, where it's like, I don't really think about my archetype very often. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you went to a psychologist who wanted to basically create these determining factors about your habits and your personality and all these different kinds of things, then it's useful.
Yeah.
For storytellers, it's also useful.
Yeah. I've been kind of dividing it a little into two buckets. I hadn't actually really been considering tropes, but the idea for me is like, a stereotype for me would be like, the hero is always the knight in shining armor.
Mm-hmm.
The big strong guy in the armor, he's the hero. Whereas to me, like an archetype would be like, Frodo Baggins is the hero, Harry Potter is the hero, Aragorn is the hero. Like, they're all these kind of different types of people, but they're still kind of following the same story beats ish,
Right.
Like, they have to go on that same type of journey of like, they don't know what they're doing to defeating the bad guy. So that's kind of where I've kind of drawn the line, but I don't know if it's
right.
I don't know if it quite works.
Kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like a bit of an arbitrary delineation though, because like, even within the archetype of a certain type of hero, for instance, within the archetype are stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like different rungs of the same ladder, if you know what I mean. So it's like, you can kind of like keep it broad. Maybe archetype is more broad, whereas stereotype is starting to specify exactly what it is. But I think for any writers out there, don't be afraid of stereotypes. Don't be afraid of archetypes or tropes or any of these things. Like, you can use them to your advantage. They are tools in your toolkit.
I actually think, especially if you're brand new, and this may be controversial, but I think if you're brand new, I think you should lean into them.
They're more useful
to help you develop something. And then you can start. I've actually made a video about this on my YouTube about world building, about basically like, if you don't know where to start with it, just take all of your favorite things from like stuff you already like and just start mashing it together. So I did when I first started mine. I basically was like, I like Aragon, I like Avatar: The Last Airbender, I like Star Wars, I like Lord of the Rings. What would happen if I just smash all that together and see what happens? And then over time, I've slowly okay, I want to change this, I want to change that, and it's because so it started as more of like a complete stereotype or almost a ripoff of like what those things were, and then I changed it to fit what I wanted it to be. Right. But if you don't know where to start, it's a great place.
Exactly. It's like reverse engineering is the best methodology at the beginning, because you love these stories. Why do you love these stories? deconstruct that and figure out like what is it about this particular one, and you can do that across a broad swath of the books and stories that you enjoy. It doesn't even have to be just books. It can be like TV, film, what have you. And just deconstruct those things and figure out like what elements really work for you, and just create your own Frankenstein monster, you know, and it will become more of an individual representation of you over time. But if you don't think about why certain stories work for you, then it's going to be a lot harder for you to write a story where it hits the beats that satisfy you as a writer, which will in turn satisfy the reader more so than if you were just trying to like come up with everything whole cloth and like, you know,
well, and
you have to learn from the people you admire. You have to learn from the stories that you've enjoyed before in order to understand what works best for you as an author.
Well, yeah, and there's also like nothing that's ever truly original. Like everything again always has elements of these stereotype archetype thing where like, so you wrote something that has a lot of unique elements to it, but it's still a detective story.
Exactly.
You know?
And at the same time, like I talk about my influences from Jeff Vandermeer, you know, or even in like my pitch for the book, it's like Blade Runner, True Detective, District 9, all three are movies, TV shows that I love. And just like throw that in a blender with Jeff Vandermeer and China Mieville and Philip K. Dick. And those are kinds of like sort of wells of inspiration that I've, you know, filled my cup and drank my fill and took so much from what they've done in order to figure out how could I write Mushroom Blues in a way that would satisfy me as a writer and hopefully satisfy readers as well. It's like nothing exists in a vacuum. You're never going to create this uber original thing. Your whole life and all the things that you've consumed over the course of your life are going to surface from your subconscious as you write a story, you know?
Yeah.
And it might even just be like an idea that is inspired by something you watched like 20 years ago or something you read like 20 years ago. You have no idea where it came from in terms of like what triggered your creative mind to pull inspiration from that particular thing. But those are the most beautiful moments because it's a callback to something that you love.
Yeah.
Something that you have basically guarded in your little, you know, like the safe that is your brain. You know? It's like it's
like
your
the
your Gringotts.
Yeah. It's like a trifecta of like, if you can write something that readers like, but you can also write something that pushes you as a writer, but then it's also something that you love. If you can hit those kind of three things, then you kind of nailed it. Yeah.
Like before I published this book, I'm like, I don't know how many people are going to be into a detective book with mushrooms. Turns out there are like quite a few. So, you know, it's like, you never know what is going to strike gold. You never know if you're just chasing trends and trying to like write to the market and stuff like that. You're always going to be behind the market because it's moving too fast for you to write and publish. Self-publishing is like a little bit easier. Some people write very fast, but at the same time, you know, I prefer to write from a place of love and passion and fascination as opposed to sales and writing to satisfy a certain market niche that is particularly popular or what have you. It's like, I prefer to write this way. If other people want to do that, it's like, that's your prerogative. But at the very least, like, I want to love what I'm writing. And I think that's a situation where a lot of the readers who picked up Mushroom Blues have kind of like caught on to how much I'm obsessed with certain things, whether it's my obsession with detective stories, whether it's my obsession with mushrooms, all of that kind of like, you know, like bleeds off the page.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and just, I think if you can create something that, like all of the classics, like, or the ones that, like, the books that keep finding new readers every generation, I think they find that because those authors wrote something that was true to themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and they really tapped into something that's very, like, I don't know what the word is, but very, like, connected to just, like, anyone who read, like, Lord of the Rings is a great example. Every single
It's
generation
timeless.
that it's totally timeless, but
Yeah.
he wasn't writing for a market. He wasn't
No.
writing for, he wrote a story he wanted to tell, and he put his whole heart and soul into it, you know?
And that's the kind of thing that has more lasting power,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like you're writing for yourself in the present, and there's no telling what the future will hold for that particular story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the beautiful thing about books, is that they exist. Obviously, there's some books that are discontinued, other books that are banned, what have you. But for the most part, stories transcend time in a
Mm-hmm.
way that few other things do. And so stories is like just rooted in the history of human beings.
Mm-hmm.
The ways in which stories permeate time and space and cultures and religions. You look at something like, you look at the Bible or the Quran or all of these different religious texts. Who 2000 years ago, 2000 plus years ago, would have ever thought that the stories that they were telling orally would be recorded, and that recording would be still read and still venerated 2000 years later?
Yeah.
Nobody's thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But stories have the power just in their mere existence to achieve something as monumental as that.
Yeah. Or even just like little stuff like, you know, I tell my daughter stories that my grandpa told me about him, you know, and they were stories that his grandma told him, you know, like we always are passing down these stories.
The oral storytelling tradition is beautiful. And it's kind of like, even if someone passes away, they still exist in the form of memories and stories. And I think that's why it's so important for, you know, families and across generations to kind of like instill this sense of storytelling and this sense of sort of like an epigenetic memory that transcends one individual person. It's like, if your grandfather is a good person and he's telling you these stories and you absolutely love these stories, you know, your dad's telling you about these stories, you're going to tell your grandkids, and it's going to become a part of the collective memory of that family and its tradition. And that expands to villages, that expands to cultures, that expands, you know, from one continent to another. And that's the beautiful thing. It's like, the stories are never going to be permanent the way that, like, oral storytelling is never going to be permanent in the way, like, this book is exactly the way it is, right? And just based on our market economy, someone's able to buy it in that exact form, that exact transcription of the words and everything. But I think the meaning that a particular individual, a particular reader pulls out of that story, their subjective meaning, is where that kind of like oral storytelling tradition comes through, where every reader is going to experience something different. And that's why it's so cool for me to be like, read reviews, see what readers are talking about, and just sort of see how they are interpreting the story that I wrote. And hopefully it's like, an interpretation that really sticks with them enough that they maybe reread it, that they pass it on to a friend or a family member, that they recommend to other people, and that is just a powerful thing. And I think if you're more true to yourself in the story that you want to tell, those are the kinds of stories that are going to hit harder with readers. Those are the stories that readers are going to come back to, whether they reread it or whether they have positive memories of it in 10, 20, 30 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, even like about writing true to yourself, markets are often very wrong. Like you said, if you're writing for the market, you're already behind. So I think about Harry Potter. I think didn't she shop that to like almost 30 different publishers? Like no one would buy it, and then it became like the biggest book thing in the world.
Right, exactly.
Still to this day.
Yeah. And you look at something like Aragon, Chris was selling those out of the trunk of his car, his parents' car, actually, at that time. Selling Aragon books at Ren fairs and like going to libraries and basically just hustling. But that garnered the attention of certain people who brought it to a higher level of marketability, and were able to push it in front of more people. And now it's like huge, not as huge as Harry Potter, but still very, very big. Yeah. And now I look at something like, like in trad publishing, Romantasy is really big. But I just see it as a bubble, It's like YA dystopia. I talked to Veronica Roth about this. She wrote Divergent, and she, looking back on it, she realized she hit a particular bubble in its prime moment and was able to capitalize on that sort of market capture. That bubble burst. How many people are wanting to pick up and publish dystopian YA? How many people are wanting to write dystopian YA? Romantasy is going through something very similar right now in traditional publishing. Whereas in the indie space and self-publishing, I see things that traditional publishers view as dead in the water, like Dragon Rider fantasy, like carrying on this torch from the Aragon days, but then I see friends like Ryan Cahill or Michael R. Miller who are really capturing a massive audience with Dragon Rider fantasy. Yeah. Epic fantasy. Traditional publishers view epic fantasy as a lost cause. Yeah. It will come back. And when it does, they will try to capitalize on it again. But in indie, epic fantasy is thriving. Epic fantasy is seeing a resurgence. And that's just the difference of certain markets like lit RPG, progression fantasy. Those are huge in indie. And trad has not figured out a way to adapt those genres to the traditional book publishing marketplace. Yeah, I think it's just because I think so. Tell me what you think about this. I think that's because we're getting to a place with creators, whether it's writers, musicians, filmmakers, whatever, any kind of creator, where like the need for a publisher or a label or any of that stuff, like everyone can build their own following. And so I feel like readers or film watchers or, whoever, consumers, we'll bundle them together, are kind of just really loving being able to go straight to the creator. Yep. Just cutting out the middleman, because then if they love a book, if they really love a movie, they can just talk directly to that creator on social media. Exactly. They have direct access. Yeah. Or like on Discord. I know a lot of authors who have a Discord, and fans are able to discuss their books. A lot of the times fans end up becoming beta readers. There are just so many more ways of interaction. There's also so many more ways of publishing now. Like music is a good comparison because music had just a real explosion with platforms like Bandcamp that gave indie musicians the opportunity to really take their craft into their own hands. And like you said, cut out the middleman. Basically, like, why do I need to get... I know musicians to this day that I met during like my journalism days who are still unsigned, basically releasing, like, some of them have started their own labels. Others are just consistently releasing music and living full time and touring off of music that they create and release themselves. And the book world is going through a similar process where it's like, yeah, like 10-ish years ago, there was the Wild West days of self-publishing where it's like Andy Weir and Hugh Howey and authors like that sort of came up.
Yeah.
But I feel like now there's a new golden age approaching, and it's much more structured because the platforms that exist are much more approachable for new people to enter into the market and know, if I want to, basically, like, if I want to publish a paperback book, there are steps that I can take in order for this thing to become a reality.
Yeah.
Without being involved in the world of agents and traditional publishers and editors and that sort of sphere. There are the resources in terms of platforms. You know, Lit RPG and Progression Fantasy really take advantage of things like Patreon and Royal Road, where they're able to give readers who might not necessarily be able to afford like 10 hardcover books a month, but they can piecemeal consume the stories that they love in long running series that are especially prevalent in things like Lit RPG and Progression Fantasy. Kickstarter as well has really, like, crowdfunding in general has really given authors an opportunity to basically like turn their writing into a business. And there are just so many more opportunities now in terms of sort of like the platforms that are available to achieve your publishing dreams. The level of quality and professionalism that is coming from the cover art space, like the artist space, the editing space. There are more printers that our authors can work directly with in order to make special editions or to just take publishing completely into their own hands. So there are more resources now than ever that don't necessitate you going down the path of traditional publishing. And from talking to so many of my friends who are traditionally published authors, like my co-host MJ, there's a lot of mental and emotional suffering that can be involved in that world. Not to say that there isn't in self-publishing, but at least in self-publishing, every mistake you make is yours, and every win is yours, and every failure is yours. But every failure is an opportunity for you as an individual and how you approach things, for you to improve. Whereas in traditional publishing, failures do not directly relate to you as an individual. And there are so many things that are out of your control that even if you had the deep desire to try and fix it, it's like, how can you fix every cog in this corporate machine that is between you and the problem that exists? How many emails, how many employees, how many distributors, all these different moving pieces, and you are basically helpless in order to really move the needle on these particular things. Whereas in self-publishing, it's like, yeah, you fuck up, that's on you. But you pick yourself up, you learn from it, and you move forward. And you have that lesson in your toolkit to be able to not commit the same error in the future. And so I think it's just way more flexible obviously a lot of it depends on the individual too. Like some people are just not built for it. And
Right.
that's something that you have to figure out as an author as well. Like, what world do you want to exist in based on your skill set, your capacity to be more entrepreneurial and delegate things versus being in the passenger seat, essentially, where agents and editors and all these different departments within a publisher are working to achieve a certain thing for your book. So it just depends on your personality, depends on what you feel you're capable of.
Yeah. Well, yeah, this has been great. It's been great talking to you. We're kind of hitting an hour here. So, but before we go, why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast, and then maybe kind of tell us where we can find you and all that kind of stuff.
Sure, ma'am. Yes, my podcast is SFF Addicts. My co-host MJ Kuhn, she's the author of Among Thieves and Thick as Thieves. The two of us, every Tuesday, we interview authors, basically in like 2-part episodes. So one week we'll release an interview with them, digging into their career, really picking their brains about things like, writing process, how they got to where they are, publishing, books and series that they've written, that kind of stuff. And then we'll follow that up with a masterclass where we give that author the opportunity to just pick something about genre, publishing, writing craft, what have you, that they're really fascinated about and want to dive into on a deeper level. So we dedicate a whole episode to talking about a specific thing that particular author is really passionate about. And so it's really fun just to be able to kind of approach writing from the perspective of both an author and a fan, to know that like I'm a fan of these authors that we're chatting with, but I'm also like, as an author, taking notes while we're talking to them and really absorbing so much of the lessons that they've learned. And a really cool part of it is that because it's a podcast, because it's on YouTube, other people can listen or watch and pull those lessons out of it for themselves as well. And it's been really good to see how helpful the podcast has been for, I don't like aspiring author as a term. I like to say like author in the making.
Yeah. I like
where
it.
It's like people who are on this path, and maybe they're unpublished, maybe they're published, maybe they're like 10 novels deep, but they can still take something away from listening to an episode and listening to their peers or listening to their their literary heroes, that kind of thing. It's just very, very useful across the board. And MJ and I are, we kind of have like the selfish hot seat where we can basically guide the conversation in such a way where we're like, we really want to know about these particular things and how this author thinks about that, depending on their experiences and how their career has gone. But everyone comes away from it. It's not like super technical and dry or anything like that. Like, we're very conversational. We swear quite a bit, and we just try to make the authors feel as comfortable as possible, which has been really cool to get feedback like that from authors who are like, this was a very fun time. Like, I haven't had questions like that before. Or just, it's like hanging out with friends on a virtual couch kind of deal.
Yeah, that's fun. It's kind of, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording about like, no one's really like, what's cool about the writing space is no one's in competition with anyone. And so,
or they shouldn't be, like, or
they shouldn't be.
The people who are in competition are kind of like ostracizing themselves.
Yeah. Cause then it's like, like that's why we're having this conversation is one, I'm interested. And then now it can live on YouTube and live on podcasts for hopefully someone can get something out of it. And
until the internet explodes and all the data is gone.
Well, you know, if that happens, we probably have bigger issues.
Yeah, exactly. We got bigger priorities.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think it's useful the fact that these resources exist in perpetuity, in air quotes. But that there are so many different podcasts out there. Every interviewer brings their own spin to things. I'm loving the fact that there are more podcasts that are popping up, and a lot of them are focusing on indie authors. Others are more focused on traditionally published authors. Some are kind of like mix and match. There's just a broader spectrum of information out there. And I think podcasting has become one of the best resources for authors, specifically in science fiction and fantasy and horror as well, in terms of learning about craft, learning about publishing, learning about the realities of getting agents and pitching your book and all this different kind of stuff, like publishing rodeo. My friends Sun Yi and Scott over there, who are doing amazing work, basically just like opening people's eyes and minds to the realities of the traditional industry through the lens of authors and professionals who work in that space and are willing to be honest and to talk about their experiences. So I think whichever path you choose, there are going to be resources for you to figure out how to approach being a writer, how to approach being a marketer, how to approach being a member of the community, how to just be a genuine and engaged and beneficial member of this whole science fiction fantasy sphere. Because it's like, there are some people who are very competitive about it. And I've heard other authors talk about them, and it's basically all they want to talk about is business, And they're like, the people that I know are kind of like off put by that. It's like, I don't want to fucking talk about business. Like I want to talk about fun stuff. I want to talk about writing craft. I want to talk about life, all these kinds of things. So be conscious about how you approach the information that you gather, but also the sort of ways in which you engage with the community and become a member of the community. It's like nowadays more than ever, like I'm part of a debut author Discord group. Like I literally just got invited over Twitter DM and had never met or heard of anybody in the group before. And now they're just really integral people in my life. And those are the kinds of things that can like uplift you in an industry that is very, very good at breaking you down.
Yeah. I think most industries are pretty good at that.
Yeah. Creative industries, especially where it's like music, for me, like tattooing, just art in general, film and television. There are just so many creative industries that are very good at just like chipping away pieces of your soul bit by bit. But I think community and you can even get a sense of community from listening to podcasts, become familiar with someone's voice and someone's personality, communicate with them on social media. And oftentimes, like in situations like this, where it's like we end up meeting at least virtually and having the opportunity to chat with each other. And I was like, cool, there's another human being here. And there's no better way to feel better about life than to get sort of, even if it isn't like always positive, but just to get genuine feedback and genuine conversation from another person. Yeah,
that's been my favorite thing of just starting this whole thing. Was it's just talking to people, just like meeting. Like been all of a sudden in just a few weeks, I've been talking to people in Ecuador where you're at, and the UK and Australia. Like I've just been talking to people all over the place, and it's just really cool to meet people and see what people are fascinating, you know? So,
and MJ always says like book people are cool people. So
yeah, I agree.
It's like, it's rare that you'll find, you know, dickheads out there, but when you see them, you'll know. And it's kind of like, you know, they do a good job of showing off how shitty they are. But for the most part, like, so many of the authors I've met have just been amazing. So many of the bloggers and podcasters and reviewers and what have you.
Yeah.
Just amazing people.
Nice. Very, very cool. Well, man, where can we find you on the socials? And then we'll link all that stuff up down below in the description.
Sounds good. You can hit me up on my website, adrianmgibson.com. That has links to all my social media, but there's also an online store where you can check out merch that I've designed. There are also tattoo designs if you feel so inclined to basically buy the rights to a tattoo and have it tattooed at the nearest shop to you. And you can also catch me on, you know, Twitter. I refuse to call it X. Instagram. Those are the two where I'm most active. Facebook as well. I'm on Threads, but I don't really use it too actively. Yeah, and then you can pick up my book, Mushroom Blues. That'll be, no, I'm pointing at MJ's. That's mine right there. You can get that in ebook, paperback, hardcover on Amazon, but you can also find it pretty much on like any online retailer like Barnes and Noble, places like that. The Broken Binding is going to have some signed hardcovers again soon. Inkstone Books as well has some signed bookplate editions. So it's all over the place. You know,
nice.
Pick the format that you fancy, and you can go check it out.
I'll be grabbing my copy and adding it to the list for sure.
Hell yeah, man! Also, you can check out the official Mushroom Blues soundtrack. That's over on Bandcamp. That was produced and mastered by my two friends in Sweden who go under the production moniker as Spore. So they created a really cool atmospheric soundscape for the book. And then we got a Spotify playlist as well. If you want to hear the music that inspired the book, basically chapter by chapter. I have like one song per chapter.
Nice. It's awesome. Well, it's been great talking to you, and thanks everyone for watching. This has been Writing Quest. Make sure to check all that stuff down below in the description, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate having me on.